President.
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to talk to the bill before us, Senate Bill 1. We've had multiple attempts to get onto this bill, and I'm hopeful that today will be that day. I wanted to briefly, for just a moment, divert to a different topic on Venezuela, which has been in the news about an hour and a half ago. The administration announced additional measures. And it's been covered in the press largely as sanctions on the regime of Nicolas Maduro, the illegitimate usurper and head of the criminal syndicate that controls the security agencies in that country. And while it most certainly is going to hurt him, I think it's important to point out that the more accurate way to describe it is Venezuela sends about 500 billion barrels of crude oil a day to the United States to be refined. That belongs to the Venezuelan people. What's been happening is that U.S. refineries pay for it. It is about 3/4 of the cash generated by the state-run oil company. And then Maduro and his cronies steal that money, not to build roads or feed people. They steal it to bribe and keep people loyal to him. So if you're a high-ranking general in Venezuela with the fancy uniforms and the stars and bars in those pictures that you see, why are they loyal to Maduro? I say loyal in quotation. They're loyal to him because he keeps providing them access to corruption. And one of those is pilfering and just completely taking out of the state-run oil company all of that cash. And that ends today. What's going to be done now is U.S. refineries are still allowed to buy crude, but the payments, instead of being made to Maduro so he can steal it, will be set aside in an account to be used by the legitimate government of that country. So if you're one of these corrupt officials that has been quote-unquote loyal to Maduro up until today because of the money, that's about to end as well, and perhaps you should reevaluate your loyalty, for lack of a better term. On the topic before us today is Senate Bill 1, and this is the bill that, among other things, is a response to decisions that were made recently on the U.S.'s presence in Syria. I believe that the decision to draw down is a mistake. I've communicated that to the President, and he invited us to the White House a couple weeks ago to have this conversation with a group of us. But irrespective of what ends up happening there's going to be byproducts of that decision. There's going to be consequences of it. And one of those consequences, several of those consequences, are going to directly impact our allies in the region. Now, let me begin by saying it's going to directly impact the United States. We already see that ISIS in Syria was on the path to morphing into a insurgency. And an insurgency is different than what they used to be. What they used to be is they took over big pieces of land, ISIS did, and they flew their black flag, and they had buildings, and in some ways that's terrifying because they control land and they have people under their command. In some ways it's a lot easier to target them because they're telling you where they are. You can see it. They're out in the open. An insurgency is different. An insurgency is when you kind of blend into the population. So by day, you might be a baker or the guy that runs a cafe. By night, you're an ISIS killer. And they sort of come in and out of the population. They don't control large swaths of territory. They sort of embed themselves. And this insurgency is sort of the threat that we faced and the challenge we had in Iraq that led to the surge to have to come back in and rectify it. In the case of ISIS, they were already on the path to doing that. This is going to make it easier for them. And it's a lot harder to target an insurgency than it is to target a caliphate. And I'm deeply concerned that the U.S. withdrawal is going to make it easier for them not just to establish an insurgency, but worst of all, is going to provide greater operational safety, in essence, more space in which they can plot to attack the United States and our interests around the world and even here in the homeland. And there's real reason to be concerned about that. You know, 9/11 doesn't happen if al-Qaeda doesn't have safe haven in Afghanistan. And I fear what ISIS might be able to do if they are able, in portions of Syria, to establish a safe haven from which they can raise money, produce videos, recruit, try to inspire terrorist attacks abroad, and even direct them. But one of the other byproducts is the impact that it has with regards to Israel. And envision Israel for a moment, small country at its narrowest point, only 9 or 10 miles wide, and it faces a threat to its north in Syria. In Syria already, in addition to ISIS and all these other criminal and terrorist elements that are there, you have a growing Iranian presence. And that growing Iranian presence begins with Iran itself. And if current trends continue, Iran is going to base within Syria surface-to-air missiles designed to shoot down airplanes. They're going to base ballistic missiles even closer now to Syria. They don't even have to launch them up to Israel. They don't have to launch them from Iran. They can now launch them from Syrian territory just off the Israeli border. They could have armed UAVs. We've seen how the Houthis have helped operationalize those. All of that sponsored by Iran, operating out of Yemen. They have also, in addition to an air route that they have established, one of the mortal enemies that Israel faces is Hezbollah. They're headquartered primarily in Lebanon, but there are Hezbollah elements all over Syria. And so for a long time now, they have been getting their armaments and their weaponry from Iran, but it had to be flown, especially in the middle of this conflict. But imagine now Iran's ability to arm and equip Hezbollah with all of these things, not just from the air, but through a ground route where they can actually ship things to them from the ground. And that's why they so desperately care about what's happening in Syria. It gives them operational space. Not to mention that Hezbollah is in Syria. There's a wing of Hezbollah that's inside of Syria. And so imagine now if you're Israel. You already faced the threat of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has already developed rockets that they're now making. They're not even shipping them anymore. They are now building these rockets. They are now developing these rockets in Lebanese territory. And they're not the rockets from the last time they had a war with Israel. These new rockets are precision guided, meaning they can actually aim them to hit certain areas and avoid hitting others. And they have a lot of them, a lot more than they used to have, which means just by volume, they could overwhelm Israeli defenses very quickly, or potentially. Well, you already have that problem in Lebanon. Imagine that exact same problem, not just from Lebanon, but to the north of you, coming from Syria, just across the Golan Heights. And so you're Israel, and you have your mortal enemy Iran, your mortal enemy Assad, your mortal enemy Hezbollah, and your mortal enemy these other radical Shia groups, all to the north of you in that country. And so Israel is taking action. And they are increasingly and openly acknowledging, as they launch these attacks into Syria to try to degrade these capabilities. You put themselves into that position, they cannot allow people, and they cannot allow organizations whose very existence is justified by the destruction of the Jewish state to openly operate and increase their capacity just north of their borders. And that's what's happening, and that's why Israel is increasingly striking. But listen to the words of in a broadcast, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, the head of Hezbollah was on television in an open television interview, and he basically warned Israel. He said, if Israel continues to strike within Syria in this way, it's going to lead to a war. And it's going to lead to a war because Syria and its allies, including them, but also Iran, are going to have to retaliate for these attacks. And so if you walk through this with me, Israel attacks out of self-defense because they have to. Syria and Hezbollah and Iran and a gang of others respond against Israel. Israel then has to respond in kind, potentially even hitting Hezbollah inside of Lebanon. And suddenly, we have another Israel-Hezbollah war, but much broader than the last one because it'll involve Syria and it'll involve Iran, and far deadlier. Because unlike the last time, they now have a lot more of these missiles, and these missiles are precision guided. This is the threat that Israel faces, and it's very real, and events there could quickly spiral into that. And one of the things our bill does is it puts in law the memorandum of understanding between the United States and Israel that says that in the case of conflict, the United States will be there to help Israel rearm and re-equip itself, and that we will work hand in hand with them on things like missile defense, which are mutually beneficial, by the way, because all of these innovations that are happening there can also benefit us here or in protecting our presence around the world. And why is this bill important? First, for the practical implications of it. We want the Israelis to be able to defend and protect themselves. It sets aside in our arsenal weapons that are held there for purposes of if Israel ever needs them. And for those who are worried about whether that would degrade our own capability, the law says that it has to be done in a way that doesn't degrade our own capabilities to defend ourselves. But what it does is it sets in place the assurance that if Israel gets into one of these wars that quickly escalates against multiple parties, by the way, Hezbollah, Iran, potentially Syria themselves, and they start running out of weaponry, rockets to defend themselves, munitions and the like, we will be there to quickly rearm them. That's just the practical implication of it. Here's the other. Israel's adversaries would know this too. They would know that if their goal is to overwhelm Israel and deplete Israel, it won't work because the United States is committed to them. And our hope here is twofold. One, to strengthen Israel to be able to withstand such an assault. But the other is to hopefully deter a war by making it very clear that Israel will never run out of missiles, they will never run out of munitions to defend themselves, because the United States will be there to support them every step of the way. And this bill, one of its first things that it does is it establishes that into our law, because this is not a threat that's going to go away in 2 years or even 5. This threat is an ancient one. It's grown more dangerous. And it's why I hope today, this bill was held up because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said they didn't want to hear any bills until the shutdown was over if the bill didn't have to do with the shutdown. Well, the shutdown is over, and so I am hopeful today that this bill, which I believe enjoys wide bipartisan support, when we finally get to vote on it in passage, I think we're going to have an extraordinary number of votes across the aisle and across this chamber that we will finally be able to begin debate on this important topic. There are other elements in this bill involving human rights violations that have occurred in Syria, supporting Jordan, and the BDS movement, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. But at its core, the linchpin of it is helping Israel defend themselves. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator is recognized.
Mr. President, first of all, let me associate myself with the remarks made by my friend and distinguished colleague from Florida. Really, the importance of this bill cannot be overstated. It is an incredibly important bill, and I rise today once again to bring it to my colleagues here in the Senate, and this time, hopefully, we can get enough votes to move it forward. It's the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act of 2019. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support moving ahead on this common-sense bipartisan legislation. This package of bills is important and time-sensitive. Israel and Jordan are our steadfast allies and friends in the Middle East, and they need support and the critical aid that this legislation would deliver. Our nations depend on one another, and we should not let them down. Included in this legislation also is a very important bill, the Caesar's Civil Protection Act, which, as I have noted numerous times before, very nearly passed the full Senate by unanimous consent last year. We were within one vote of getting unanimous consent on it. This legislation is long overdue. 500,000 Syrians have died at the hands of the Syrian dictator Assad, his friends, their allies, and it's past time that we put an end to it. This bill includes strong financial sanctions to target those responsible in the Assad regime for the terrible loss of life and destruction in Syria. Further, it extends sanctions to those who would support the Syrian regime's actions in the war in Syria, such as Iran and Russia. The tragic loss of life in Syria has gone on far too long. We need to take action now to pressure those who have the ability to bring this war to an end. And they do have the ability to bring this war to an end. The State of Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and it is surrounded by oppressive nations, many of which, like Iran, wish to do Israel harm. Their security and stability in the region is of extreme importance to all Americans. This legislation would protect Israel where we can here in the United States by rejecting anti-Israel boycotts. Mr. President and colleagues, I hope today you will all join me in a bipartisan way in moving forward on this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. Cruz, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change their votes If not on this vote, the yeas are 74, the nays are 19. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn, having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to upon reconsideration.